Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be the only one left in a massive empty building with nothing but the hum of fluorescent lights to keep you company? This story belongs to a man named Thomas, who worked the night shift as a janitor in a sprawling office complex. It was a job he took to pay the bills, but it was also one that would lead him to a terrifying experience he would never forget. One particular night, as Thomas started his shift, a strange sense of dread washed over him. The building was always quiet at night, but this time, the silence felt oppressive, almost as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. He pushed his cleaning cart down the deserted hallways, the sound of the wheels echoing eerily through the space. His first task was to clean the large conference room on the top floor. As the elevator creaked its way up, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt heavy, and the lights flickered just enough to make him uneasy. When the elevator doors finally opened, he stepped out into a hallway that seemed darker than usual. The overhead lights buzzed softly, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. Thomas entered the conference room and began his usual routine, wiping down the long table and straightening the chairs. But as he worked, he couldn't help but feel like he was being watched. He glanced towards the doorway, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the hallway was empty. The sensation was so strong that he found himself working faster, eager to finish and move on to the next task. As he bent down to pick up a piece of trash, he caught a glimpse of something in the large windows that lined the room. It was a shadow darting across the glass, as if someone or something had just passed behind him. Thomas whipped around, but the room was empty. His heart pounded in his chest as he stared at his reflection in the glass, trying to convince himself that it was just a trick of the light. Determined to shake off the fear, Thomas moved on to the next floor, where he had to clean the cubicles. The open space was eerily quiet, with rows of empty desks bathed in the pale glow of computer screens left on standby. As he dusted the desks, he heard a faint tapping sound, like fingers drumming on a hard surface. He paused, listening intently, but the sound stopped as soon as he noticed it. He continued cleaning, but the tapping resumed, louder this time and closer. Thomas's pulse quickened as he followed the sound, leading him to a corner cubicle. When he peeked around the partition, there was nothing there. No one in sight, just the faint echo of the tapping still ringing in his ears. By now, Thomas was on edge. He decided to head to the janitor's closet to grab some more supplies, hoping that focusing on work would calm his nerves. But as he approached the closet, he heard a low, guttural whisper. It was so faint that he couldn't make out the words, but it was enough to send a chill down his spine. He stood frozen, listening to the silence that followed, his mind racing with possibilities. Summoning the courage to continue, Thomas reached for the doorknob, but just as his hand touched the cold metal, the door swung open on its own. He jumped back, heart pounding, and stared into the dark closet. For a moment, he thought he saw movement inside, but when he flipped on the light, there was nothing but cleaning supplies and shadows. The unsettling feeling that had been building all night was now impossible to ignore. Thomas quickly grabbed what he needed and shut the door, but as he turned to leave, he felt a cold breath on the back of his neck. His skin prickled with fear, and he spun around, only to find himself alone in the hallway. He backed away slowly, the sense of being watched stronger than ever. Every instinct told him to leave the building, but his sense of duty kept him rooted in place. With trembling hands, Thomas resumed his work, moving to the final area, the basement storage room. This part of the building was always unsettling, even during the day. The long, narrow corridors seemed to stretch on forever, and the dim lighting did little to dispel the shadows that clung to the walls. As he entered the storage room, he felt the temperature drop, the air becoming almost suffocatingly cold. He hurried through his tasks, eager to finish and leave, but as he was about to exit, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Thomas lunged for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as he pounded on the door, shouting for help, but his voice was swallowed by the thick darkness surrounding him. He could hear the whispers again, growing louder and more insistent, as if they were coming from right behind him. In a final act of desperation, Thomas threw himself against the door, and to his surprise, it flew open, sending him stumbling into the hallway. He didn't stop to question it. He bolted for the exit, leaving his cleaning cart and supplies behind. As he burst through the front doors and into the cool night air, he felt the oppressive weight lift from his chest. But the fear lingered, gnawing at the edges of his mind. Thomas never returned to that building after that night. He quit his job the next morning, unable to shake the feeling that something malevolent was lurking in those dark, empty hallways. And though he tried to forget, the memory of that night would haunt him forever. This is a story about a man named Alex, who often found himself working late into the night, long after his colleagues had left the office. On this particular night, he was racing against a deadline, his eyes glued to the computer screen as he typed away. The office was eerily quiet, save for the constant hum of the fluorescent lights above him. The hours ticked by, and as the clock neared midnight, Alex noticed something strange. His computer screen began to flicker, the display momentarily cutting out before returning to normal. At first, he dismissed it as a glitch, a harmless quirk of the old system, and continued working. But then it happened again. This time, the screen didn't just flicker. It showed brief, ghostly images, barely visible, but unmistakably there. They were faces, pale and distorted, like old photographs left to decay. Alex blinked, unsure if his tired eyes were playing tricks on him. He shook his head and continued typing, trying to focus on his work. The flickering grew more frequent, and the ghostly images became clearer. They were the faces of people, their expressions twisted in anguish, their eyes hollow and haunting. Alex's fingers froze on the keyboard as he stared at the screen, unable to look away. The faces seemed to be staring back at him, their mouths moving as if trying to speak. A chill ran down his spine, and Alex felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He looked around the empty office, suddenly feeling very alone. The silence that had once been a comfort now felt oppressive, as if the very air was pressing down on him. He tried to dismiss the images as a figment of his imagination, but the fear gnawing at his gut told him otherwise. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Alex decided to dig into the company's history. He opened a browser and began searching for information on the building and its former employees. What he found sent a shiver through him. Several years ago, there had been a series of mysterious disappearances. Employees had vanished without a trace, their desks left untouched, their belongings still in place. As he read through the old news articles, the flickering on his screen became more intense. The ghostly images appeared more frequently, lingering longer with each flicker. It was as if the faces were becoming more real, more desperate. Alex felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead as he realized that the people he was seeing were the very employees who had disappeared. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. These were the lost souls of those who had once worked in the same office, trapped in some horrific limbo, trying to reach out from beyond. They weren't just images, they were ghosts, their tortured spirits bound to the place where they had met their untimely end. Alex's hands trembled as he continued to search for answers. He dug deeper, uncovering a dark secret about the company. It turned out that the disappearances were not accidents. The company had been involved in illegal experiments, using its employees as unwitting test subjects. Those who didn't survive the experiments were quietly disposed of, their fates covered up by the higher-ups. The more Alex uncovered, the more the faces on his screen seemed to come alive. They were no longer just flickers. They were there, staring at him, their mouths forming silent screams. He could feel their pain, their anger, their desperation. It was overwhelming, suffocating, as if the weight of their suffering was pressing down on him. In a panic, Alex tried to shut down his computer, but the screen wouldn't turn off. The faces remained, staring at him with hollow eyes, their mouths moving faster now, their silent screams growing louder in his mind. He could hear them, even though no sound was coming from the computer. It was as if the voices were inside his head, echoing off the walls of his mind. He jumped up from his chair, knocking it over as he backed away from the desk. But no matter where he looked, the faces were there, reflected in the windows, the glass doors, even in the glossy surface of the conference table. They were everywhere, surrounding him, closing in on him. Desperation clawed at his chest as he tried to escape the office. But as he reached for the door, it slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. The lights flickered and dimmed, casting the room in a ghostly glow. Alex was trapped, and he knew it. There was no escape from the vengeful spirits that now haunted him. The faces on the screen began to change. They were no longer just staring. They were moving, reaching out as if trying to pull him into their world. The screen distorted, the images warping and twisting into something monstrous. Alex's breath came in short, panicked gasps as he realized that he was no longer just a witness to their torment. He was becoming a part of it. He could feel them pulling at him, dragging him toward the screen, toward their world of endless suffering. The office around him seemed to melt away, replaced by a cold, dark void. The faces were all he could see, their hollow eyes boring into him, their mouths stretched into grotesque grins. In that final moment, as the darkness consumed him, Alex understood what the ghostly figures had been trying to communicate all along. They weren't just showing him their torment, they were welcoming him into it. He had uncovered the truth, and now he would suffer the same fate as those who had come before him. And just like that, the flickering screen went dark. This is the story of Sophia, a young woman who recently took a job as an overnight receptionist at a secluded motel, far from the bustling city. It seemed like an easy job, a quiet place where she could work through the night without much hassle. But as the days turned into weeks, Sophia began to notice something strange. The motel had its fair share of guests, people who checked in late at night, weary travelers looking for a place to rest. But there was one thing that kept gnawing at the back of her mind. The guests never seemed to check out. At first, she thought it was just her imagination. Maybe they left early, before her shift ended. But then she started paying closer attention. She checked the guest log and noticed that names were added each night, but there was never a record of anyone leaving. The rooms remained occupied, but the guests themselves seemed to vanish without a trace. Sophia's unease grew with each passing night. She tried to ask her co-workers about it during the shift change, but they brushed her off with vague answers, saying it wasn't her concern. It was as if they knew something she didn't, something they were too afraid to talk about. One particularly quiet night, curiosity got the better of her. She decided to investigate. She waited until the motel was completely silent, the only sound the ticking of the old clock behind the front desk. Then she took a spare set of keys and began her rounds, checking each room one by one. The first few rooms were empty, just as she had expected. But as she moved further down the hallway, she noticed a strange smell, faint at first, but growing stronger with each step. It was a sickly sweet odor that made her stomach turn. She followed the scent to the end of the corridor, to a room that was listed as occupied. Her hands trembled as she inserted the key into the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, musty room. The smell hit her like a wave, so overpowering that she had to cover her nose and mouth. She fumbled for the light switch and flipped it on. The room was empty, or at least it seemed so at first glance. But as Sophia stepped inside, she noticed something horrifying. The bed was neatly made, but there was a dark stain seeping through the sheets. It was unmistakably blood, dried and crusted over. The sight sent a chill down her spine. She backed out of the room, her heart pounding in her chest. But something compelled her to keep going. She checked the next room, and the next, and the next. Each one told the same story, empty, yet filled with signs of violence. Bloodstains on the walls, shattered mirrors, and deep scratches carved into the furniture. Sophia's breath came in ragged gasps as she moved from room to room, the horrific realization dawning on her. The guests hadn't left. They had never left. Something had happened to them, something terrible, and the motel had swallowed them whole. In a panic, she rushed back to the front desk, her mind racing. She needed to get out, to call for help. But as she reached for the phone, the lights flickered and went out. The entire motel was plunged into darkness. Sophia's heart skipped a beat, and she felt a cold sweat break out on her skin. She grabbed her flashlight from the desk drawer and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the thick darkness. But the light offered little comfort. The shadows seemed to shift and move at the edges of her vision, and she could feel an oppressive presence closing in on her. Sophia tried to leave, but the front door was locked, the deadbolt refusing to budge. Panic set in as she frantically searched for another way out, but every door, every window was sealed shut. It was as if the motel itself was alive, trapping her within its walls. And then she heard it. A faint, shuffling sound coming from the hallway. She turned, the flashlight beam shaking in her trembling hand. The sound grew louder, closer, echoing off the walls. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps, but they weren't the footsteps of someone alive. Sophia backed away, her breath hitching in her throat. She knew deep down that whatever was coming for her wasn't human. The shadows at the end of the hallway seemed to deepen, forming into a shape, a figure that moved with unnatural slowness. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body refused to obey. She was frozen, rooted to the spot as the figure drew nearer, its form becoming clearer in the dim light. It was one of the missing guests, but twisted and distorted, its face a grotesque mask of terror. The figure stopped just a few feet from her, its hollow eyes staring into hers. It opened its mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Instead, A low guttural moan filled the air, reverberating through the empty motel. Sophia felt a wave of nausea wash over her as the figure reached out, its hands skeletal and cold. In that moment, Sophia knew the truth. The motel was a trap, a place where souls were consumed, where the living were transformed into something monstrous. She was next, and there was no escape. The last thing she saw before the darkness claimed her was the figure's twisted smile, its teeth sharp and gleaming in the faint light. The next morning, the day shift receptionist arrived to find the front desk empty, the computer screen still flickering. Sophia was never seen again, her name added to the long list of missing guests. The motel continued its operations, luring in unsuspecting travelers with its vacancy sign, a place where no one ever checked out. Christopher worked the night shift at a call center, seeking the quiet and solitude that came with the job. The office was usually empty at night, with only the hum of computers and the occasional ring of the phone to keep him company. But one night, everything changed, and the silence turned into something far more sinister. It began with a call from an unknown number. When Christopher answered, all he heard was a soft, trembling whisper, "Help me." Before he could respond, the line went dead. He shrugged it off as a prank, but an unsettling feeling gnawed at him. Then the calls kept coming, each one more disturbing than the last. The voices on the other end were different every time, some pleading for help, others warning him of something ominous. What disturbed him the most was that they all seemed to know his name. Christopher tried to trace the calls, hoping to find a logical explanation. What he discovered chilled him to the bone. The calls were coming from lines that had been disconnected years ago, from a time long before he worked there. The realization sent a chill down his spine, and the quiet office suddenly felt oppressive. Determined to understand what was happening, Christopher dug into the call center's history. He uncovered a dark chapter that had been buried and forgotten. Years ago, a tragic fire had swept through the building, trapping an entire team of employees inside. Their calls for help had gone unanswered, their voices lost in the chaos, and the incident had been quietly covered up by the company. As the horrifying truth sank in, the lights in the office began to flicker, casting eerie shadows that seemed to stretch toward him. The air grew colder, and Christopher felt an otherworldly presence surrounding him, as if the spirits of those who had perished were still lingering, waiting for someone to hear their cries. The voice on the other end was clear, filled with terror. "You're next." Christopher's heart pounded as the line went dead again, leaving him in the suffocating silence of the darkened office. He knew he had to leave, but the shadows seemed to hold him in place, as if the building itself didn't want him to escape. In a final desperate attempt to escape, Christopher ran for the emergency exit. But as he pushed the door open, he was met with a wall of flames, just like the fire that had claimed the lives of the employees years ago. The ghostly figures surrounded him, their hollow eyes filled with the terror of their final moments. Christopher's screams echoed through the building as the flames closed in, engulfing him in a sea of heat and pain. He realized too late that the voices on the phone hadn't just been warning him, they had been luring him into their eternal torment. When the morning shift arrived, the office was as it always had been, silent, empty, and cold. There was no trace of Christopher, no sign that he had ever been there. The phones continued to ring, their haunting tones echoing through the empty office, as the call center's dark past claimed yet another victim.